It was a Thursday evening when Daniel came home with that smile, the same careless, half-charming grin that used to make my heart flutter years ago. But that night, it felt different. Maybe because I'd seen it too many times lately, a mask that tried to hide something deeper, something quietly cruel. He dropped his keys on the counter, loosened his tie, and said casually, "Hey, babe, don't wait up tonight. There's this reunion dinner with a few old colleagues, and, my ex will be there." Then he laughed, like it was the most harmless thing in the world. Just dinner. Nothing more. He said it like that, nothing more. And that's when I knew. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I kept stirring the soup, pretending to taste it. The room smelled like rosemary and garlic, but beneath it all was the bitter taste of suspicion I'd been swallowing for months. Daniel had been growing distant too many late nights, too many half-truths. The kind of distance you can't measure in miles, only in silence. And tonight, that silence was screaming louder than ever. "Sure," I said finally, with a small, polite smile. "Enjoy your dinner." He came up behind me, placed a quick kiss on my cheek. His touch used to feel warm. That night, it felt like a draft, cold and brief, gone before I could even process it. He grabbed his jacket and left, and that's when the house, our beautiful, carefully curated home, became my theater of truth. Because Daniel didn't know I'd already seen the messages. He didn't know I'd watched them meet outside his office last week, her hand brushing his arm like old habits reborn. He didn't know that the woman he once left me for Claire wasn't just his ex anymore. She was back in his orbit, and he was letting her in. But the thing is, I wasn't going to scream, I wasn't going to cry, I was going to wait. I walked into the study, sat down at Daniel's desk, and opened his laptop. I'd found his password months ago. He always underestimated me that way. While he thought I was fragile, emotional, and easy to fool, I was quietly learning every pattern, every move. I clicked open his email, nothing incriminating there. He wasn't stupid. But then I opened the hidden folder I'd discovered weeks ago. A folder labeled Work Slides Q3. Inside were photos. Dozens. Her. Him. Smiling across tables. Clinking glasses, standing too close in hotel lobbies, and one picture, one single image that made my stomach turn the two of them in a mirror. Her holding the phone, him behind her, smiling like a man who'd forgotten his vows. That was when something inside me settled, not rage, not heartbreak. Something colder. Clarity. I printed one of the photos. Just one, and I framed it. When I placed it on the dining room shelf, the one right behind where he always sat, I felt a strange calmness. It was hidden in plain sight, so obvious yet invisible to him, because Daniel never looked at the little things. He only saw what he wanted to. That night, I waited. I poured myself a glass of wine and watched the clock. Every tick was a memory of the early years, the laughter, the way he used to hold me when life felt heavy. But love can fade so quietly you don't even notice it leaving, like sunlight slipping away from your windowsill. At 11:23 p.m., the door opened. Daniel walked in, smelling faintly of expensive cologne and cheap betrayal. "Hey," he said softly, almost testing the air. "You're still up?" "Yeah," I said, closing my laptop. "How was dinner?" He shrugged, loosened his collar. "Good, just catching up." "Claire was there, you remember her?" I smiled. "Of course I do." He hesitated, watching me. Maybe expecting jealousy. Maybe guilt tugged at him for a split second. But when I gave him nothing, no accusation, no anger, he relaxed. He even laughed. "You're really something, you know that?" He said, pouring himself water. "Most wives would have made a scene." "Oh, Daniel," I said quietly. "I've learned that scenes are overrated. Reality is far more interesting." He looked confused, but shrugged it off and turned toward the living room. As he passed the shelf, his eyes skimmed over the frame, but just for a second. He didn't notice. Not yet. And that's when I realized he never really saw me anymore. Not the meals I made, the care I took, the effort I gave. He didn't see the woman who stood by him through failures and nights of self-doubt. And now, he wouldn't even see the truth when it was staring back at him. I followed him quietly, leaned against the doorway. He sat on the couch, scrolling through his phone, a faint smirk on his lips, maybe replaying the evening in his mind. I wanted to say something. To shout, to demand why, but instead I asked softly, "Do you ever think people can truly change?" He looked up, surprised by the question. What do you mean? I mean, do you believe that once someone breaks something, trust, love, loyalty, it can ever be whole again? He frowned slightly. Depends on the people, I guess. Why are you asking? I smiled again. No reason, but inside my heart whispered because I used to believe we could. He yawned, stretched, and said he was heading to bed. I nodded and watched him go. When he disappeared down the hallway, I turned toward the shelf again. The picture stood there, quiet and damning, waiting for morning light to reveal it. He had no idea what I'd done, and that was the most peaceful feeling I'd had in months. Because sometimes, revenge doesn't need to scream. Sometimes, it just needs to be framed and left where love once lived. The next morning began like every other, or so Daniel thought. The coffee machine hummed softly in the kitchen as sunlight crept across the marble floor. I was already awake, sitting at the table, stirring my cup absently. The framed photo behind his usual chair glimmered in that morning light, the glass catching a perfect sliver of gold. It was quiet. Too quiet. When Daniel walked in, his hair still damp from the shower, he smiled that lazy, charming smile again. Morning, beautiful. Morning, I replied calmly. He poured himself coffee, leaned against the counter, and took a sip. You're up early. Everything okay? I smiled faintly. Couldn't sleep. My mind was a little busy. He chuckled, half listening, his attention fixed on his phone again. You worry too much, Emma. You always do. Emma, that was my name, and he said it like it meant nothing anymore. Once he used to whisper it softly at night, like it was something sacred. Now it sounded routine, like punctuation. He sat down, pulling his chair out just a bit too far, his back brushing the shelf behind him. His elbow almost knocked the photo down. I held my breath. He turned his head slightly, eyes landing on it for just a second. He frowned. Hey, what's this? My pulse didn't change. I didn't even blink. Just a new decoration. I moved some things around yesterday. He reached for it. I could feel my heart pounding in my throat. His fingers brushed the frame, but he didn't really look at it. Not closely? Not enough to see the truth staring back. He placed it back where it was and grabbed his mug again. Looks nice, he said casually, sipping his coffee. You've always had a good eye for this stuff. I smiled faintly, almost pitying him. Thanks. I try. He didn't know he had just admired the evidence of his own betrayal. After breakfast, he left for work, humming under his breath the same tune he used to whistle when he was hiding something. I waited until his car disappeared down the street before exhaling, feeling the weight of restraint in every muscle. I didn't want to destroy him. Not yet. I wanted him to see himself first. To look into the mirror I had built for him not of glass, but of guilt. That day, I went about everything as if it were normal. I watered the plants, replied to emails, even went for lunch with my friend Nora. But behind my calm, there was a quiet current of purpose. Nora had been the first to notice Daniel's change months ago. She leaned across the cafe table that afternoon, her voice low but sharp. You sure you're okay with this whole dinner with the ex thing? Because honestly, I'd have lost it. I stirred my tea, staring at the swirl. Oh, I'm more than okay, Nora. Her brows furrowed. That tone scares me, I smiled. Good. When I returned home, the light in the living room had shifted again. The framed photo stood still untouched, waiting. I adjusted it slightly, angling it so that the face of his ex, Claire, would catch the light perfectly when Daniel came home. I wanted it to be undeniable, but subtle enough that his own curiosity would lead him there. I knew my husband well. He'd notice eventually. His pride wouldn't let him ignore something out of place forever. By evening, I cooked his favorite meal, rosemary chicken, and roasted vegetables, the same dish I made the night we got engaged. It was deliberate. Every scent, every sound in that kitchen carried memory and manipulation intertwined. When he came home, the smell hit him immediately. Wow, he said, loosening his tie, walking toward me. Someone's in a good mood. Just felt like cooking, I replied smoothly. He grinned, kissed my cheek, that practiced gesture that had long lost meaning, and sat down at his place. His usual place. Right beneath the photo, we talked about mundane things. His office, my errands, the weather. He didn't notice a thing at first. But as he reached for his wine glass, his eyes flicked toward the shelf. Then again, something shifted in his expression. Hey, he said slowly, his voice tightening. Where did you say you got that picture? I looked up innocently. Oh, that one? I don't really remember. Why? He leaned back slightly, squinting. It just looks familiar? I tilted my head, pretending to study it. Does it? He got up, glass in hand, and walked over to it. The faintest tremor of panic danced across his features as he looked closer. His hand froze midair, and then it hit him. He went still. Completely still. His jaw tightened, his breath shallow. He didn't say a word for almost 10 seconds, just stood there, staring at the reflection of his own sins framed neatly on our dining shelf. When he finally turned, his face was pale. Where did you get this? His voice wasn't calm anymore. I looked him straight in the eyes. I found it. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Emma, listen. No, Daniel. My tone stayed level, soft even. You listen. You told me last night it was just dinner. You said it was nothing more? But this? I gestured toward the photo. This looks like more than dinner to me. He took a step closer. It's not what it looks like. I almost laughed. The irony was too rich. That's the funny part, Daniel. It's exactly what it looks like. For once. He rubbed his temples, muttering something about mistakes and confusion, his voice trembling between guilt and panic. I let him stutter. I let him try to build a tower of excuses on quicksand. Then I said quietly, I'm not leaving you. Not yet. That made him look up, startled. I want you to sit with what you've done, I continued. I want you to wake up every day and see that picture. To eat breakfast beneath it. To feel what it's like to be haunted by something you chose. He didn't answer. He couldn't. As he stood there, the air between us thick and trembling, I picked up my plate and walked away. I left him in the dining room, alone with the photo and himself, and for the first time in a long time I felt free, because I didn't just want to expose him. I wanted him to live inside his own lie, and every time he passed that shelf, he would. That night, Daniel didn't sleep. I could hear the faint creak of the floorboards. His pacing from one end of the room to the other. The air felt thick. Guilt has a way of making the walls breathe heavy. I lay in bed, facing the window, pretending to sleep. Every few minutes he would stop, probably glancing toward the shelf in the dining room. The image of that photo burned behind his eyelids. I knew it would. I wanted it to. In the morning, the silence was different, strained, careful. He moved slower, quieter, almost as if he was afraid of making a sound that would remind me he was there. Coffee? He asked softly, voice hoarse. I nodded without turning around. Sure. He brought me a cup, his hand trembling slightly as he set it on the table. I noticed his eyes flicker toward me, searching for some clue, anger, accusation, anything. But I gave him nothing. That emptiness was more powerful than any rage could ever be. When he left for work, I watched him from the window. His shoulders hunched in a way they hadn't before. Regret has a physical shape. You can see it in the way a person moves when their lies have finally grown too heavy to carry. But my plan wasn't finished. Not yet. I waited until late morning before I drove across town, to a place I hadn't been in years. Claire's office. It was strange seeing her again, the woman who'd once stolen my husband's loyalty, and, in her own way, forced me to rediscover my strength. She was still beautiful, maybe more than before, but not in the way that mattered. Her beauty was polished, now cold, curated, like something you frame and hang but never touch. When she saw me walk into the lobby, her face faltered for a brief moment before she composed herself. Emma, she said, forcing a polite smile. Wow, it's been a while. Yes, I said softly. It has. We stood there in that sterile, air-conditioned quiet, both pretending to be calm. Then I said, I thought I should thank you. Her eyebrows knitted together. Thank me? Yes, I said, for reminding me who I am. Before she could respond, I placed a small envelope on the front desk. You'll know when to open it. And then I left. Inside that envelope was a copy of the same photo printed on matte paper, folded neatly. On the back, I had written just 2 words. He told me everything. I wasn't sure what she'd do with it, but I knew Daniel would feel the consequences of it soon enough. When I returned home, the house was silent again, almost peaceful. I lit a candle, made tea, and sat by the window, watching the light move across the floorboards. I wasn't angry anymore. I was watching my own story unfold, one I had finally taken control of. By evening, Daniel came home earlier than usual. He looked disheveled, his tie loose, his eyes tired. "Rough day?" I asked casually. He hesitated, then sat down heavily on the couch. "Claire called me today." "Oh?" I sipped my tea. "How's she doing?" He rubbed his face, groaning. "She's furious, Emma. She said you sent her something." "Did I?" I interrupted, my tone light. He looked at me like he didn't recognize the woman sitting in front of him. "What are you doing?" "I'm not doing anything, Daniel. I'm just showing you things you refuse to see." He exhaled, his voice breaking slightly. "You can't fix this by making us miserable." I smiled faintly. "No, but I can make sure you feel it." He stood, running a hand through his hair, pacing like a man whose lies were finally losing their footing. "It was a mistake," he said again, almost pleading now. "It didn't mean anything. Then why did you hide it?" He opened his mouth, but no words came. Only silence thick, heavy silence that filled every inch of the room. I stood, my voice calm but cold. "You think I framed that photo just to punish you, Daniel?" "No, I framed it because I wanted you to remember what honesty costs. Every day you walk past it, you'll see the version of yourself you chose to become." He stared at me, eyes glassy, whispering, "You've changed." "I had to," I said. "You taught me that." He turned away, his voice trembling. "I don't even know who you are anymore." I smiled softly, though my heart ached with something deeper than anger. "Maybe that's because you stopped looking long before I stopped loving you." He didn't answer. He just stood there, a man drowning in his own silence. Later that night, as he sat alone at the dining table, I watched him from the hallway. His eyes lingered on the framed photo again. But this time he didn't look away. He picked it up, stared at it for a long moment, then set it back down carefully. His lips moved, but I couldn't hear what he said. Maybe it was an apology. Maybe it was just regret whispered too late. For the first time, I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt release. Because revenge, as quiet as mine was, doesn't fill the emptiness. It just clears the space where love once lived and leaves you staring at your own reflection in its absence. As I turned off the lights and headed to bed, I whispered into the dark, "You're right, Daniel. It was just dinner, but now it's just us and nothing more." The house was silent again. Only this time, it was my silence, my peace, and he finally understood what it meant to lose something not through anger, but through quiet, deliberate truth. The days that followed were thick with silence, not the peaceful kind that comes after resolution, but the kind that hums beneath the surface. Waiting to break, Daniel started changing his routine. He came home early, tried to help in the kitchen, even complimented my cooking things he hadn't done in years. But his voice carried that edge of guilt, every word balancing between apology and fear. He had stopped touching the framed photo. He didn't even look in that direction anymore, but I could feel its presence burning into him every time he entered the room. It had become our third guest, the unspoken truth sitting quietly at every meal. One evening, while folding laundry in the bedroom, I heard the faint buzz of his phone vibrating on the dresser. I hadn't gone through it since everything began. I didn't need to anymore. But this time, something made me pick it up. A new message flashed across the screen. "Claire, you've ruined everything." I smiled faintly, my fingers brushing the edge of the phone. He had indeed. I put it back before he could see, then continued folding, humming softly to myself. When Daniel entered the room moments later, his face was pale. "Emma, can we talk?" I didn't look up. "We've been talking." "No, I mean, really talk." He hesitated, then said, "I messed up." "I know I did, but I want to fix this. I can't lose you." I stopped folding. For a moment, I wanted to believe him, that maybe the guilt had broken through the layers of arrogance and habit. But then I remembered every night I sat waiting, every lie disguised as a half-truth. "Fix what?" I asked quietly. "You didn't break a vase, Daniel." "You broke me." He flinched, the words cutting through his fragile apology. "I just want a chance." "No." My voice was calm but final. "You don't get to ask for chances when you've already spent them all." He looked at me then, like a man who'd suddenly realized the finality of his own choices. His shoulders sagged. His eyes dropped. That night, I slept soundly. for the first time in months. The next morning, I woke to the smell of burnt toast and the sound of Daniel fumbling in the kitchen. He was trying to make breakfast a peace offering, perhaps. I stood in the doorway, arms crossed. "Trying something new?" I asked. He smiled sheepishly, scraping the toast into the sink. "You deserve breakfast in bed after all I've put you through." I wanted to laugh not at his attempt, but at the irony. The same man who once dismissed my efforts as too much fuss was now trying to serve me burnt toast as redemption. I walked up to him, took the plate, and set it on the counter. "Daniel, stop trying to erase it." "You can't. I just want you to forgive me," he said, voice cracking. "I'm not perfect, but I love you." I looked at him for a long moment. "You love the idea of me, the version of me that stayed quiet while you lied. The one who made excuses for your absences and smiled through your neglect." He swallowed hard. "And the woman standing in front of me now? She's not here to be loved," I said softly. "She's here to be heard." He didn't say anything. His eyes glistened, and for a brief second I almost pitied him. But pity is dangerous. It invites you to soften when you should stay steady. I turned away and began gathering some papers from the counter. "I spoke to Claire," I said suddenly, my tone even. He froze. "What?" "She knows. About everything." His eyes widened, his voice low. "You didn't?" "I did," I interrupted. "Because she deserves to see who you are, too. Not just me." He stepped forward, his voice trembling. "Emma, that's cruel." I looked back at him, unflinching. "No, Daniel. What you did was cruel. I'm just showing the truth." He sank into a chair, running his hands through his hair. "You've turned into someone I don't even recognize." I stared at him for a moment, then said quietly, "No, you just never bothered to look." That afternoon, Claire showed up at our house. I wasn't surprised. She stood on the porch, her eyes burning with anger. "What did you tell him?" she demanded the moment I opened the door. I stepped aside, letting her in. "Everything." Daniel appeared from the hallway, his face paling as he saw her. "Claire, don't." She cut him off, glaring. "You lied to me too. You said she didn't matter. That it was over." He looked between us, trapped. I didn't want to hurt anyone." I almost laughed at that. "That's the thing about lies, Daniel. They don't avoid hurt, they delay it. And when it finally comes, it's 10 times sharper." Claire turned to me, eyes narrowing. "You think this makes you the better person?" "No," I said calmly. "It makes me honest," she scoffed, muttering something under her breath before walking out, slamming the door behind her. Daniel stood frozen, the sound of that slam echoing in the air between us. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then I said softly, "Now you know what it feels like. To watch someone walk away because of something you could have prevented if only you'd cared sooner." He sank back into the chair, defeated. "What happens now?" I picked up my coat and purse, heading for the door. "Now," I said, "you get to live in the truth you built." "Where are you going?" he asked, his voice cracking again. I looked over my shoulder, my tone steady. "To remember who I was before you made me forget." And as I stepped out into the evening light, the air felt different, clearer. For the first time, the weight of his lies wasn't mine to carry anymore. It was his. And he would carry it every time he walked into that dining room, every time he saw that photo. Because sometimes, justice doesn't look like revenge. Sometimes, it looks like absence. And in that quiet space where love used to live, I finally found something else myself. The night I left, I didn't cry. I didn't even pack much, just a few clothes, my journal, and the small silver locket my mother gave me when I got married. She had said, "May this always remind you of the home you're building." Back then, I believed that home was a person. Now I understood it was me. I drove without direction for hours, letting the hum of the tires drown out my thoughts. The city lights faded into dusky fields, and by the time I stopped, the world had gone quiet. I found a small inn by the sea, a modest place where no one knew my name, and that was the first relief I'd felt in years. That first night alone was strange. The bed felt too big, the silence too honest. For so long, my solitude had existed inside a house filled with another person's noise. Now it was mine, raw, unfiltered, terrifying, and beautiful. The next morning, I woke to the sound of gulls and the smell of salt. I made myself coffee, sat on the balcony, and for the first time in forever, didn't feel the need to check my phone. There were no unread messages, no unanswered questions. Just space, the kind of space that demanded healing. Back home, Daniel was unraveling. Nora texted me a few days later, her message short. "He's been asking around for you." He looks terrible. I read it, then turned off my phone again. Guilt flickered for a brief moment, not for what I'd done, but for the fact that I still cared, even after everything. Love, I realized, doesn't vanish like anger. It lingers quietly in the places that used to be warm. But caring and returning are not the same. One afternoon, I walked along the beach, the sand cool beneath my bare feet. An older woman sat near the shore, sketching waves in a notebook. When our eyes met, she smiled, one of those knowing, gentle smiles that only people who've survived heartbreak seem to carry. "You look like someone who finally let go," she said softly. I smiled faintly. Maybe I just stopped holding on to the wrong things. She nodded, sketching another line. "That's usually when the right things start finding you." I didn't know it then, but she was right. Over the next few weeks, I started piecing myself back together, slowly, deliberately. I started painting again, something I hadn't done since college. The canvas became a confession, each brush stroke an untold emotion. I painted light, not the kind that blinds, but the kind that forgives. Every so often, I thought of Daniel. Not with bitterness anymore, but with a distant compassion. I wondered if he still lived in that house, whether he'd taken the photo down or left it as it was a relic of the day everything changed. Then, one rainy evening, he found me. I had just stepped out of the inn's little cafe when I saw his car pull up. He looked older, thinner, like guilt had carved him hollow. When our eyes met, there was no anger, just a heavy kind of sadness. He stepped closer, stopping a few feet away. "Emma, Daniel," he hesitated, glancing down. "You left without saying a word." I folded my arms gently. Words weren't working between us anymore. He nodded slowly. I deserved that. The sound of rain filled the silence between us. Then he said, "I took the picture down." I raised an eyebrow. "That doesn't change what it showed." "I know," he said quietly. But I couldn't stand looking at it. "I see it every time I close my eyes anyway." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he said softly, "You were right. It wasn't just dinner. It was selfishness. It was me trying to fill a void I created myself. And I ruined the only thing that ever mattered." His voice cracked on the last word, and for a moment, the man I'd loved, not the one who betrayed me, flickered back into view. But he was just a memory wearing regret. "I didn't come to fight," he continued. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry. Not because I want you back, but because you deserve to hear it." Rain rolled down the side of his face, mingling with tears he didn't bother to hide. "Do you forgive me?" he asked quietly. I took a breath, letting the question sit in the air. "I don't think forgiveness is something I give," I said softly. "It's something I live, and I'm learning to live again." He nodded, his eyes wet. "You always were stronger than me?" "No," I said. "I just finally stopped pretending weakness was love." He tried to smile, but it came out broken. "Take care of yourself, Emma." "You too, Daniel." He turned and walked away, his figure dissolving into the rain. I stood there for a long time, watching until he disappeared, the last ghost of a life I'd already outgrown. When I went back inside, the woman from the beach was there again, sipping tea by the window. She looked up, her eyes soft with understanding. "You look lighter," she said. "I just said goodbye," I replied. She smiled. "Sometimes that's the most sacred thing we can do." That night, I sat by the window, the sea whispering beyond the glass. I opened my journal and wrote a single line. He didn't know what I'd hidden in plain sight. It wasn't revenge. It was my strength, and for the first time, that truth didn't hurt. It healed, because what I'd really hidden wasn't a photo or a secret. It was the version of myself I thought I'd lost, the one who could walk away from pain without needing to destroy, the person who caused it. Daniel had his silence, now, and I had mine, but mine was peace. The sea has a way of teaching you things, patience, renewal, how to surrender without feeling defeated. Weeks turned into months, and slowly, the ache that used to wake me up at 3 a.m. softened into something gentler memory. I still thought of Daniel sometimes, but not with anger anymore. More like a faint echo of a song I used to love but had outgrown. The inn became my home for a while. The owners, a kind older couple named Martha and George, treated me like family. Martha would bring me tea every evening and sit with me on the porch as the sun melted into the horizon. "You've got that look," she said one evening, rocking gently in her chair. "What look?" I smiled. The one people wear when they've survived something that should have broken them. I glanced at the water, the waves shimmering in gold. "Maybe surviving isn't about staying whole," I said quietly. "Maybe it's about learning how to live with the cracks," she smiled knowingly, "and how to let light through them." That night, I dreamed of my old house not as a place of pain, but as a chapter I'd finally closed. In the dream, the photo frame on the dining shelf was empty, and I woke up realizing it didn't need to hold anything anymore. I started painting again with new purpose. My art had changed, less structure, more flow. I painted waves, hands reaching for sunlight, faces turned toward the wind. Martha convinced me to display them in a local gallery. The thought terrified me, but she said something that stayed with me. "Pain doesn't shrink you, Emma. It expands you if you let it." Opening night was small but warm. Strangers lingered by my canvases, whispering words like peaceful and raw. I stood in the corner quietly watching. For the first time, I wasn't invisible. Among the small crowd was a man I hadn't noticed before, quiet, attentive, with a kind smile that didn't try to fix you, just saw you. His name was Andrew. He introduced himself gently, as though afraid to disturb something fragile. "I hope you don't mind me saying," he said, pausing in front of a painting of an open window, "but your work feels like freedom." I smiled softly. "That's what it became for me," he nodded. "Then you must have earned it the hard way." That made me laugh, not a bitter laugh, but a real one. You have no idea. We talked for hours that night. Not about love, not about the past, just about stories, art, life, and the beauty of beginning again when you least expect it. There was no spark, no instant rush, just a calm understanding. The kind that doesn't demand anything, only offers presence. Over time, Andrew became part of my days in the quietest ways. He never asked about Daniel. He didn't need to. Some people understand that the past doesn't need explaining. It just needs respecting. One afternoon, as we walked along the beach, he asked, "Do you ever think about going back?" "To what?" "To the life you left." I paused, watching the waves roll in. "Sometimes," I admitted, "but only to remind myself how far I've come." He nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes the hardest thing isn't leaving, it's forgiving yourself for staying as long as you did." I stopped walking, looking at him. "You sound like someone who's been there." He smiled faintly. "We all have our stories, Emma." That evening, when I returned to my little seaside room, I opened my journal again. The first few pages were filled with pain-raw, jagged words from nights when I felt like I was disappearing. But now I flipped to a fresh page and wrote, "Forgiveness isn't something I give to others anymore. It's something I offer to the parts of me that waited too long to let go." The next morning, I mailed a letter to Daniel. No return address, no blame. Just closure. It read, "Daniel, I don't hate you. I never did. I simply grew tired of trying to love someone who couldn't meet me where I stood. I hope you find peace not in the arms of another, but within yourself. Thank you for showing me what I'm capable of surviving, Emma." I didn't need to know if he'd read it. Some words are meant to be released into the world, not received. That night, I walked along the shore again. The air was cool, and the waves shimmered under the moonlight. I stopped, closed my eyes, and let the wind brush against my skin. For the first time, I wasn't waiting for someone to return. I wasn't hoping for explanations or apologies. I was simply there, present, whole. A small child nearby laughed, chasing the tide, and I realized that sound, pure, innocent, unbroken, was the sound of life continuing. Of healing. Of grace. Andrew joined me, his footsteps soft in the sand. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. The quiet between us was comfortable, not the silence of secrets, but the peace of understanding. I turned to him and said softly, "It's strange. The life I built once felt like everything, but when it fell apart, it gave me space to build myself instead." He looked at me for a moment, then smiled. "And you did." I looked back at the horizon, the first hint of dawn glowing faintly on the water. Because somewhere between betrayal and forgiveness, between grief and growth, I had found something unexpected, not revenge, not victory, but stillness. The kind of stillness that comes when you finally realize that some endings aren't punishments. They're invitations. Invitations to begin again. And as the sun rose over the sea, I whispered the truth I had carried all along. What I hid in plain sight was never a trap. It was a mirror, and I finally learned to see myself in it. 6 months later, my life felt unrecognizable, not because everything had changed, but because I finally had. The little seaside town that had once been my refuge had quietly become my home. The waves outside my window were no longer a reminder of what I'd lost. They were proof of how far I'd come. They moved endlessly forward, never backward, reshaping the shore with every tide. I had learned to do the same. I rented a small art studio by the water. At first, it was just for me a sanctuary where the scent of paint and salt blended into something calming. But over time, people started to stop by. Women mostly. Some young, some older. Some newly divorced, others still trapped in marriages that hollowed them out. They came to talk, to paint, to breathe. It wasn't planned. Healing never is, but somehow the space became a quiet circle of survival. We didn't call it therapy. We called it Thursday Light, because every Thursday evening, the studio filled with soft music, laughter, and the kind of conversations that didn't need fixing, just listening. There was Lila, whose husband had left her for someone half her age. She painted sunsets every week, never oceans. "I've seen enough waves to last me a lifetime," she'd say with a smile that was still learning how to be brave. And there was Rosa, who hadn't told her husband she was leaving yet. She'd dip her brush into blue paint every time she wanted to say something she couldn't. One evening, she looked at me and said, "You make it look easy." I shook my head. "It's not easy. It's necessary." Those words lingered in the room like truth always does, quiet, but undeniable. I didn't set out to become a guide. I was just a woman who'd once framed her heartbreak and learned to hang peace in its place. But slowly, through these women, I began to understand something deeper. Pain can either bury you or it can root you. The difference lies in whether you decide to grow from it. One evening, as I was cleaning brushes, Martha walked in. Holding a letter. "Mail for you," she said softly, handing it over. My heart hesitated when I saw the handwriting. Daniel's. I didn't open it right away. I took it outside, sat by the water, and watched the light fade from gold to silver. The sea was calm that evening, almost kind. Finally, I broke the seal. Inside was a single page. "Emma, I've sold the house." I couldn't stay there anymore. Every room was a reminder of what I destroyed. I kept the photo, though. Not because I want to remember her, but because I need to remember me. The man who thought a lie could stay hidden forever. I don't expect forgiveness. But I wanted you to know that I'm trying. I'm in therapy. I've stopped drinking. I even started painting. It's terrible, you'd laugh. But it's something. If I could go back, I'd listen more. Not to my guilt, but to you. You deserve that. You always did. Thank you for the mirror you left behind. Daniel, I folded the letter carefully, my hands steady. There were no tears, just a soft ache, the kind that comes from finally understanding that closure doesn't always mean reconciliation. Sometimes, it's just the peace of knowing someone finally saw what you were trying to show them all along. When I went back inside, the studio was quiet. A few candles flickered in the corners. I pinned Daniel's letter to a small corkboard near the window, not out of sentiment, but out of gratitude. Beneath it, I placed a note that read, "We all leave mirrors behind. Some reflect who we were, some who we became." Weeks passed, and Thursday Light grew. People began to donate canvases, paints, and brushes. Someone even brought snacks one evening, and soon it became less of a class, more of a gathering, a home. And somewhere in that gentle rhythm of stories and strokes of color, I realized I was finally ready to move on, not from Daniel, but from the version of me that had needed his approval to exist. Andrew was still there, too quietly, patiently. Never pushing, never asking for more than I could give. One night, after everyone had left, he stayed behind to help me clean. We worked in silence, the soft hum of the ocean filling the space between us. When we finished, he leaned against the doorway and said, "You've turned pain into something beautiful, Emma." I smiled. I didn't turn it into beauty. I just stopped hiding it. He looked at me with the kind of warmth that doesn't ask to be earned. "You deserve everything that comes next." For the first time in years, I believed it. Later that night, I stood outside, looking at the horizon. The moon hung low, silver light gliding across the sea. I closed my eyes and whispered a quiet thank you not to Daniel, not even to the universe, but to myself, for staying, for leaving, for surviving. The tide washed closer, brushing my feet, reminding me that even endings move in rhythm. I went back inside, turned off the lights, and before closing the studio door, glanced once more at Daniel's letter. It no longer hurt. It simply was. Because in the end, what I'd hidden in plain sight wasn't just a photograph or a quiet act of revenge. It was the truth that healing begins the moment you stop waiting for someone else to see you, and finally decide to see yourself. And as the sea breathed against the shore, I smiled not for what I'd lost, but for everything I had finally found. A year passed. It's strange how life rebuilds itself in silence quietly, without fanfare, like the sea mending its own waves after every storm. My days had found a rhythm now. The studio thrived, the laughter of women painting side by side echoing through its walls like music. There were no ghosts here anymore, only colors. I had painted a new series 12 canvases, each representing a month of my rebirth. January was all muted grays and gentle blues. By June, the palette had softened into warm golds and pinks. And December? It was almost white a stillness that felt like peace. The gallery owner from the nearby city had seen my work and invited me to display the collection under one title, Hidden in Plain Sight. At first, I hesitated. That phrase carried so much of my past, Daniel, the betrayal, the framed photograph that started it all. But then I realized it also carried my truth, my power, my evolution. So I agreed. Opening night was in early spring. The air smelled like salt and rain, and the city lights shimmered against the gallery windows. The space was full locals, visitors, a few critics. But none of that mattered. What mattered was that every piece hanging on those walls had once lived inside me as pain, and now they breathed as art. When the lights dimmed slightly for the curator's speech, I found myself drifting to the corner where my favorite painting hung. It was a quiet seascape, a woman's silhouette standing at the edge of the water, looking toward dawn. As I stood there, someone spoke softly behind me. I thought I might find you by this one. It was Andrew. His voice still carried that calm steadiness that made the world feel less sharp. I turned, smiling. You always seem to know where to look. He handed me a small bouquet of white lilies. For the woman who finally learned to be seen. I laughed softly. You make it sound like I've reached some kind of enlightenment? He tilted his head. Haven't you? I looked at the painting again. Maybe I've just learned that peace isn't a destination. It's something you practice. He nodded slowly. And you do it beautifully. The evening continued, filled with kind faces and quiet admiration. People asked me about my work, my inspiration, my story. I shared parts of it, not the full truth, just enough. Because the full truth wasn't about a cheating husband anymore. It was about rediscovering a woman who had once mistaken silence for strength and learned that real strength speaks softly, but never hides. Toward the end of the night, the crowd thinned. The soft hum of conversation faded into the gentle murmur of closing time. That's when I noticed someone standing near the entrance, hesitant, almost unsure if he should step forward. Daniel. For a moment, the air in my chest stilled. He looked different, older, but calmer somehow. His eyes weren't haunted the way they used to be. He waited until the last guest left before approaching. Your work is beautiful, he said quietly. It feels honest. Thank you, I replied, my voice steady. He looked around, taking in the paintings. You always had that gift, turning pain into something people can't look away from. I met his gaze, not unkindly. Maybe I just learned that truth deserves to be seen no matter how uncomfortable it makes people. He nodded, his eyes glistening. I deserved that. There was no bitterness in his tone. Just truth, plain, simple truth. I read your letter, I said. It meant more than you think. He exhaled slowly, as though those words gave him permission to finally breathe. I didn't expect you to respond. I just wanted to say what I never said before. I know, I said softly. And that's why it mattered. He looked down for a moment, then met my eyes again. You look happy. I am, I said honestly. Not because everything worked out, but because I did. A faint smile crossed his face, the kind that carries both sorrow and gratitude. I'm glad, Emma, really. We stood there for a moment. Two people who had once shared everything and lost it, now standing as strangers bound only by lessons. Before he turned to leave, he said quietly, "You were right. It was never just dinner." I smiled faintly. I know, and that was it. No grand goodbye, no apologies left unsaid. Just peace, the kind that comes when the past stops echoing. After he left, I stepped outside into the night air. The rain had started again, soft, rhythmic, cleansing. Andrew joined me, holding an umbrella. Old chapter visiting? He asked gently. Maybe, I said. But this time I didn't need to read it again. He smiled, and we walked quietly toward the car. The sound of our footsteps blended with the rain, steady and sure. Later that night, back in my studio, I stood before a blank canvas. The smell of rain drifted through the open window. I picked up a brush, dipped it in white, then blue, then gold. For the first time, I didn't paint to forget. I painted to remember not the pain, but the transformation, the becoming. When I stepped back hours later, the image was simple: a table, a single frame on it, and through the glass, not a photo, but a reflection of the sea. Because in the end, what I'd hidden in plain sight was never vengeance. It was me. The woman who stopped waiting to be chosen, the woman who turned her heartbreak into her masterpiece. The woman who realized that closure isn't something someone gives you, it's something you create for yourself, quietly, deliberately, until one day you look at your life and see light where once there was only shadow. And as the waves whispered outside my window, I smiled, whispering to no one but the night. It wasn't just dinner. It was the beginning of my freedom. Another year passed, 2 winters and 2 springs since the night Daniel walked, away from that gallery and out of my story for good. Time, I'd learned, doesn't erase things. It transforms them. It turns grief into wisdom, pain into perspective, and silence into clarity. My studio, Thursday Light, had become more than a creative space. It was now a quiet revolution of healing. The women who came there didn't come to paint perfectly. They came to tell their stories without words and sometimes without tears. Some brought children, some brought old diaries. Some just brought themselves, fragile but brave like I once was. We laughed. We cried. We healed not all at once, but in brushstrokes and moments. On one wall, I'd hung a quote: "We are not broken by what happens to us. We are shaped by what we choose to create after." It became our mantra. One day, a young woman named Elise joined us. She was in her early 20s, eyes hollow, hands trembling slightly as she held a brush. She painted nothing at first, just sat and watched the others. When the session ended, she lingered behind. "Everyone here seems so strong," she whispered. "I don't think I'll ever get there." I smiled softly. "Neither did I," she frowned. "You seem like you've always had it together." I laughed gently. "Oh no, Elise. I used to measure my worth by how quiet I could stay while falling apart." Her eyes welled up. "How did you stop?" "I didn't," I said. "I started listening to the part of me that wanted to live louder." She nodded slowly, wiping her tears. I handed her a small canvas. "Start with color," I said. "You don't need a plan. Just start." That day she painted her first streak of blue, trembling but determined. I watched her and realized something profound. My healing had quietly become someone else's beginning. That night, when the others left, I sat alone in the studio, surrounded by the scent of acrylic and the hum of the sea outside. I opened my journal, now thick with notes and sketches, and began to write again, not about Daniel this time, but about everything that came after. We spend so much time asking why they did what they did, that we forget to ask what it taught us to become. My words flowed easily now, not from pain, but from peace. Later that week, I received an invitation from a local women's conference. They wanted me to speak not just about art, but about transformation. About finding meaning in moments that once broke you. The thought terrified me. I was a painter, not a speaker. But Martha, who still dropped by every Thursday with her homemade cookies, simply said, "Emma, you've been speaking for years just with color instead of words." And so, I said yes, the day of the event. The hall was full faces I didn't know, yet all somehow familiar. I could feel their stories in their eyes. When I stepped onto the stage, I took a deep breath, feeling my heart steady. I used to think my story ended the day my marriage did. I began softly. But I was wrong. That day was just my prologue. The room fell silent. I thought strength meant staying, I continued. That forgiveness meant forgetting. That peace was something someone else could give me. But what I've learned is simpler and harder peace begins when you stop needing to prove your worth to the person who broke it. A quiet murmur rippled through the crowd. Some nodded. Some wept silently. I hid a photograph once, I said, my voice calm but sure. A single image that exposed a lie. Back then, I thought that was my power to make him see what he'd done. But now I know what I really hid in plain sight wasn't revenge. It was my resilience. My refusal to disappear quietly. By the time I finished, the room stood in stillness. Not applause, not noise, just silence heavy with understanding. The kind of silence that heals. Afterward, dozens of women came up to me, some hugging, some just whispering thank you. Among them was Elise, holding a small painting in her hands, a swirl of blues and yellows that looked like both a storm and a sunrise. For you, she said shyly. Because you showed me both can exist at once. I took it, my eyes stinging. That's beautiful, Elise, she smiled. You taught me that, so am I. That night, I placed her painting beside my own on the studio wall. And for the first time, I realized I had stopped collecting pain. I was collecting stories. Each one was a reflection of survival. A mosaic of moments that proved none of us were ever truly alone in our breaking. As I stood there, the moonlight streaming through the window, I whispered to myself, it started with a lie. But it ended with truth, because Daniel's betrayal wasn't my ending. It was my unveiling. The photograph I once framed to wound had instead framed me the woman I'd forgotten to see. And as I locked the studio that night, I smiled softly, knowing the truth of it all. He never saw the picture on that shelf. But I did, and I finally understood it was never meant for him. It was meant for me. The following year, Thursday, light became something I never planned, something far larger than a room of paint and stories. It became a sanctuary for women who had been silenced. Word spread slowly, then suddenly like light slipping through cracks until the whole room glows. Women started traveling from nearby towns to attend. Some brought sketches. Some brought poems. Others brought nothing but tears and left with color on their hands. We added a second-day Monday stillness where there were no brushes, no music, just quiet reflection. Some wrote letters they never intended to send. Others simply sat and watched the ocean breathe through the windows. I never called it therapy. It was something more sacred than that. It was remembrance. A place to remember that pain was not weakness, that survival was not shame, and that beauty could exist even in the aftermath of betrayal. One afternoon, as I prepared the studio, I received an unexpected email. It was from Daniel's sister, Claire, the same woman who once despised me for making a scene when I first confronted her brother's lies. Emma, I wanted to tell you that Daniel passed away 2 months ago. Heart failure. It was sudden. He had been sober for over a year and had started teaching art classes for children at the community center. He used to talk about you not with guilt anymore, but with gratitude. He said you gave him the mirror he needed, even if it took him years to understand what he was seeing. He kept your letter in his wallet. I know this message may be painful, but I thought you should know that your kindness changed him even if too late. Claire, for a long time, I just sat there, the hum of the ocean in the background, the words sinking slowly into my chest. My hands trembled slightly as I folded the letter. I hadn't thought of Daniel in months. He had become a shadow I no longer walked beside. But now he was gone, no redemption arc, no second act. Just finality, and yet, I didn't cry. I closed my eyes and whispered, "Be at peace." Not because he deserved it, but because I finally did. That evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, I walked to the shore. The wind was soft, carrying the scent of salt and lilacs. I stood there a long while, watching the tide draw its lines in the sand, erasing them again and again. In that rhythm, I saw us two imperfect souls who had once collided, broken, and rebuilt. Not together, but somehow still intertwined in what we learned. When I returned to the studio, the women were already there. The light was golden, filtering through the windows like forgiveness itself. I didn't mention the letter. Some things are too sacred to explain. Instead, I said softly, "Tonight, let's paint something we never had words for." The brushes began to move. Strokes of blue and amber, violet and gold. The room filled with quiet determination. Healing didn't need sound, it just needed presence. As I moved among them, I noticed Elise painting a lighthouse. Its beams stretched over the sea, reaching places the eye couldn't see. "That's beautiful," I whispered. She smiled shyly. I wanted to paint something that never stops shining no matter how dark it gets. I touched her shoulder gently. "You already are." Later that night, when everyone had left, I sat alone by the window. The moon hung low, reflecting across the tide. I took a blank canvas and wrote across it in soft white paint. It was never revenge, it was revelation. And beneath it, smaller. "You taught me to see, Daniel." And I finally did. I let the paint dry overnight, then hung it in the studio, no frame, no signature, just words. Every Thursday, women would pause in front of it, tracing the letters lightly with their eyes. No one asked who Daniel was. No one needed to. Months passed. The studio's walls became a gallery of silent confessions, each painting a piece of someone's truth. And one evening, a journalist visited to write about the growing movement. She asked me, what inspired all of this? I thought for a long moment, then said, "A photograph." She blinked. "A photograph?" I nodded. "One that used to remind me of betrayal. But now it reminds me that what we hide in plain sight often isn't what others see, it's what we refuse to see in ourselves." She smiled softly. "And what did you see?" I looked around the room, at the women laughing, at the walls breathing with color and courage. "I saw light," I said simply, "even in the dark." That night, when everyone left and the candles burned low, I stood before the ocean again. It was quiet, endless, forgiving. I whispered into the breeze, "You were right, Martha. Light does find its way through the cracks." And in that moment, I understood closure isn't an ending. It's a horizon. You never reach it, but you keep walking toward it anyway. I turned, locking the studio for the night, feeling the peace I had once thought impossible. Because in the end, what I'd hidden in plain sight wasn't a secret. It wasn't vengeance, it was hope. The kind that stays, the kind that rebuilds, the kind that teaches you that every shattered piece was never proof you were broken, but evidence that you were meant to shine. And somewhere, deep within that truth, I whispered one last time, softly but with certainty. It wasn't just dinner, it was the moment I started to see myself. Years slipped by quietly, like waves smoothing over footprints that once seemed permanent. Thursday Light had grown beyond anything I could have imagined. What started as a small circle of women sharing pain through color had become a movement, an echo of healing that rippled far beyond the little seaside town. I was in my late 40s now. My hair carried strands of silver that I wore proudly, like ribbons of wisdom. The lines near my eyes deepened when I smiled, and I smiled often. Not because life was perfect, but because I finally lived it without apology. The studio had expanded 2 rooms now, with tall windows that opened toward the sea. There were days when the sound of laughter filled the space so completely that I would stop and just listen, remembering the silence that used to live here instead. Every so often, a new woman would arrive, uncertain and fragile, clutching pain like a secret. I always knew that look the way she'd linger by the doorway, as though unsure whether she deserved to step inside. I'd greet her the same way every time. Welcome home. Because that's what Thursday Light had become, not just a place, but a home for lost voices. That spring, a university reached out. They wanted to feature my story, the art, the movement, the transformation in a course about resilience and creative healing. When the letter arrived, I laughed softly to myself. There was a time when I couldn't even say my husband's betrayal out loud. Now students would study it as a story of strength. It wasn't pride I felt. It was grace. One day, as I stood before a fresh canvas, a thought came quietly. Maybe this was what forgiveness truly was, not letting him back into my life, but letting go of the weight of remembering. That afternoon, as the waves shimmered beyond the window, I took out my old journal, the one I'd started the night I left home. Its pages had turned yellow with time, the ink smudged from tears and rain. I ran my fingers across the first entry. He said it's just dinner. Nothing more. And I smiled, because it had been everything more. It was the moment that shattered the illusion and freed me to build something real. I flipped through the pages, the anger, the sorrow, the healing, the forgiveness, until I reached the last empty one. Slowly, I began to write again. If pain is the price of awakening, then I'd pay it again. Because it taught me to see myself without the reflection of someone else's eyes. When I finished, I closed the journal for the last time. That evening, we held a celebration at the Studio Thursday Light's 5th anniversary. Women from years past returned, their lives blooming in new directions. Lila had started teaching art in schools. Rosa had finally left her marriage and opened a small cafe. Elise, the shy girl who once trembled with her first brushstroke, now ran her own creative retreat in another town. They brought stories, laughter, and paintings, hundreds of them. The walls were alive with color, layers of survival and self-discovery. When it was my turn to speak, I stood by the window, the sunset spilling warmth across the floor. I didn't prepare a speech, I just spoke from where it hurt once, but no longer did. 5 years ago, I began softly, I thought my story ended with heartbreak. But it didn't. It just changed shape. What I learned is that endings are never the enemy, silence is. The silence we keep inside ourselves when we stop believing our voices matter. I paused, looking around at the faces that had found light again. You are proof that pain is not the opposite of beauty. It's part of it. The room fell quiet. Some cried. Others just smiled through their tears. Afterward, Andrew, still the same gentle soul who had walked beside me through all those years, came forward, holding a small wrapped box. "What's this?" I asked. He smiled. "Open it." Inside was a photo frame, wooden, simple, beautifully crafted. But this time it was empty. No picture, no memory. Just a small note inside that said, "You don't need proof anymore. You have presence." Tears pricked my eyes, not from sadness, but from the quiet realization that I had come full circle. The frame wasn't for pain anymore. It was for possibility. That night, when everyone left and the candles flickered low, I placed the empty frame on the same shelf that once held Daniel's photograph, the same shelf that started everything. And as I looked at it, I whispered, "Now you hold the only thing that matters, peace." Outside, the sea sang its eternal lullaby. The wind carried the scent of salt and memory. And I thought about how strange it is that sometimes the things that break us most are the very things that build us into who we were always meant to be. Before locking up, I turned to the empty frame once more. It glowed faintly in the candlelight, reflecting my own face back at me, a face no longer defined by loss, but by light. I smiled, turning off the last lamp, because in the end, the story was never about a husband, an ex, or a photograph. It was about a woman who learned that even in the most ordinary betrayal, there is an extraordinary rebirth waiting hidden in plain sight. And when you finally see it, you don't just survive the story, you rewrite it. 10 years later, the town hadn't changed much, the same cobbled streets, the same salty wind that smelled of sea and rain. But everything about me I was 50 now, though time had been kind. The world had softened in my eyes, not because life was easier, but because I'd stopped trying to resist its imperfection. The sea outside my window was the same one I'd stood beside a decade ago, broken and unsure, but now it looked different. Maybe because I looked at it differently, Thursday Light had become something far greater than I ever intended. What started as 6 women painting quietly around a wooden table was now a foundation. We held workshops, mentorship programs, art therapy retreats, and all of it rooted in one belief: that truth, once spoken, can heal. Sometimes, I still walked through the original studio, the small, humble room where everything began. It smelled faintly of paint and jasmine candles, just as it did on that first night when I picked up a brush with shaking hands. The old wooden shelf still stood by the window, the one where Daniel's photograph once lived. But now, the empty frame Andrew gave me hung above it, untouched, timeless. It wasn't a reminder of absence anymore. It was a symbol of everything I had chosen to fill my life with since: meaning, peace, and light. One afternoon, as I was sorting through old paintings for a gallery exhibit, I came across my very first canvas, the one I painted after leaving Daniel. It was dark, stormy, full of raw emotion. I traced the edge of it, smiling faintly. "You were my beginning," I whispered to it. A knock sounded at the door. When I opened it, a young woman stood there nervous, holding a folder close to her chest. "Hi," she said softly. "I'm Anna. I was told you help people paint through grief." Her voice trembled the way mine once did. I nodded gently. "Come in." As she stepped inside, she looked around, her eyes widening. "It's so calm here," she whispered. "It wasn't always," I said with a small smile. "But it learned to be." We sat together for hours that day. She told me about her heartbreak, a betrayal so familiar it almost felt like hearing my own story through younger lips. I didn't give her advice. I just listened. When she finished, she looked at me, eyes wet. "How do you stop hurting?" she asked. I thought for a long moment before answering. "You don't," I said softly. "You outgrow it. Like a shell that used to fit but doesn't anymore." That evening, she picked up a brush. Her hands trembled at first, but when the paint touched the canvas, something shifted in her eyes, that first flicker of release. Watching her was like watching my own ghost take its first breath all over again. After she left, I stood by the window, watching the waves. The sun was melting into the horizon, painting the sky in amber and rose. I felt a peace so deep it almost hurt. Because for the first time, I realized I wasn't just healing anymore. I was guiding others home through their storms. A week later, I attended a ceremony in the city. Thursday Light had been chosen for an award in community healing through art. Standing on that stage, under bright lights, I thought about the woman I used to be, the one who once stood in a kitchen pretending not to care when her husband said, "It's just dinner." If I could speak to her now, I'd tell her this: you will break, you will fall apart quietly in ways no one sees. But one day, you'll build something out of those pieces, something so beautiful it will make sense of every ache. When I returned home that night, the sea was calm, a full moon resting gently on the horizon. I poured myself a cup of tea and sat beside the empty frame on the shelf. In the reflection of its glass, I saw my face older, softer, whole. For a long moment, I just looked. That frame had seen everything: my heartbreak, my transformation, my rebirth. It was no longer empty. The glass now reflected the life I had built, the love I had given back to the world. And in that reflection, I saw every woman who had walked through that door, every painting, every tear, every breath of courage that had filled the silence I once feared. I whispered, "This is what I was hiding all along." It wasn't a secret. It wasn't a plan. It was potential. The potential to rise. To rebuild. To return to myself. Outside, the tide rolled in gentle, rhythmic, endless. I stood up, opened the window, and let the night air sweep through the room. The scent of salt and peace filled the space, and I closed my eyes, breathing it in deeply. In the distance, I heard laughter, the sound of women from the studio finishing another session. Their joy carried across the breeze like music. I smiled, whispering into the night, "You see, Daniel, it was never about you. It was about who I became because of you." And as the waves whispered their eternal lullaby, I realized something profound: my story didn't end because of betrayal. It began because of truth, and that truth had built a legacy of women who no longer hid their light, of voices that refused to stay quiet, of stories that proved you can turn pain into art and still have room for love. When I turned away from the window, the empty frame glowed faintly in the moonlight, not hollow, not lonely, but full of life, full of everything I once thought I'd lost. And as I walked toward it, I whispered one last time, softly, peacefully, it wasn't just dinner. It was destiny hidden in plain sight. 10 years became 15. The world kept moving as it always does, but I had found a rhythm of my own, one that didn't rush, didn't chase, didn't break. I lived quietly now in a small house overlooking the sea, not far from the studio. Thursday Light still thrived, though I had handed most of it over to Elise. Watching her teach, guide, and listen the way I once did filled me with a joy deeper than pride. It was the kind of joy that comes when you see someone carry the torch you once lit in your darkest hour. Some mornings, I'd sit on the porch with tea, listening to the gulls, the tide, and the laughter of life happening just beyond the window. I had long stopped writing about pain. My journal now held gratitude lists, fragments of poems, and sketches of sunsets that no photograph could ever capture. I still kept the frame, that same simple wooden frame Andrew had given me years ago. It hung on my living room wall now. The glass slightly faded, the wood smooth from time. Visitors often asked why it was empty, and I always smiled. Because not everything beautiful needs filling, I'd say. Some spaces are meant to remind us of what we've made room for. One evening, as the sun melted into the sea, I found myself thinking of Daniel not with sorrow, not even nostalgia, but with a gentle understanding. For years I had believed that forgiveness meant saying it's okay. But now I knew. Forgiveness simply meant saying it happened. And I'm free. Sometimes I imagined him painting with the children he once taught, laughing without guilt, seeing beauty again. That thought didn't hurt me. It healed me. Because peace, I'd learned, is not the absence of the past. It's the acceptance that the past shaped you into who you were always meant to be. As twilight deepened, I stepped outside, the air cool and soft against my skin. The horizon glowed faintly, the first star trembling awake. I whispered into the wind, not as a goodbye, but as a blessing. Thank you, Daniel, for breaking what needed to be broken, so I could finally learn how to rebuild. The sea answered in its eternal rhythm, the waves folding against the shore like quiet applause. And as I turned back toward my home, I looked once more at the frame on the wall, that quiet, empty space that had witnessed my entire becoming. It no longer symbolized loss or love. It symbolized life, and the woman reflected in its glass was no longer waiting to be seen. She was complete, unhidden, free. Because in the end, it was never about revenge. It was about resurrection. And the truth I once hid in plain sight had finally revealed itself, not as a secret, but as a lesson. Sometimes the thing that shatters your heart is the same thing that sets your soul free.